On January 7th, 1945, snow weighs heavily on the branches, the frost creeping through wool uniforms. For days, the men of the 551st Parachute Infantry Battalion have fought through hunger and exhaustion. Their boots are frozen stiff, feet wrapped in burlap or whatever scraps they could find, as their winter gear never arrived. Ahead of them is Rochelinval, a small village on high ground, the last crossing point for retreating German forces. If they take it, they cut off the escape route. Standing at the front, with the frost clinging to his helmet, the battalion's leader, Lieutenant Colonel Wood Joerg, doesn't waste words, as he has a single order left to give: take Rochelinval, no matter what. A shot cracks through the stillness. Whether a misfire or an accident, it doesn't matter. The German response is immediate. Machine guns cut through the snowfield, sending men sprawling. Mortars slam into the ground, shaking the earth. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the battalion pushes forward to Rochelinval, where the last fight of the 551st Parachute Infantry Battalion has just begun. Get off your ass. The 1st Battalion, 551st Parachute Infantry Regiment, was activated on November 26, 1942, at Fort Cobb in the Panama Canal Zone, with the original purpose of training for a planned invasion of Vichy-controlled Martinique, a key resupply base for German U-boats in the Caribbean. From its inception, the 551st comprised a rowdy lot of mavericks, its earliest days marked by high rates of AWOL, fistfights, and heavy drinking. However, upon taking his place as the battalion's leader, Lieutenant Colonel Wood Joerg instantly became the heart of the unit. With a reputation for fierce loyalty, discipline, and an unshakable sense of duty, this seasoned officer quickly earned the respect of his rowdy troublemakers, not by breaking them, but by leading them. One of Joerg's most common phrases was, quote, "Get off your ass." The battalion quickly took this motto to heart, turning the phrase into their identity. Soon, they were calling themselves by its initials, the Goyas. But when the mission to take over Martinique was scrapped, the 551st no longer had a clear objective, despite months of intense jungle training. From then on, as was common for non-divisional units in the U.S. Army, the 551st was repeatedly shuffled and reassigned, attaching to different commands. In the summer of 1943, they were sent stateside to train in airborne operations before heading to war. To avoid any potential leak of information, they were under strict orders of secrecy and were forbidden to wear their hard-won insignia, had to hide their newly acquired tattoos that reveal their military affiliation, and were prohibited from leaving the base. That same fall, upon arrival at a camp in North Carolina for even more training, Lieutenant Colonel Rupert Graves abruptly replaced Lieutenant Colonel Joerg, the complete opposite in age, personality, and leadership style. With this sudden and unexplained decision, discipline all but crumbled. As more and more men went AWOL, the remainder drilled relentlessly, even testing the feasibility of using gliders as paratroop transport. But the operation was a complete failure, with many of the flimsy aircraft falling apart mid-air, sending troopers tumbling out unpredictably. When Joerg was put back in command, the exasperated leader found his battalion falling apart. Standing before his jailed paratroopers, he made them an offer they simply couldn't refuse. Fall back in line, and he'd get them out. With this, the cell doors opened, and now, with the battalion reformed and their beloved Joerg back at the helm, the 551st was finally sent to war. Dragoon. Though the Goyas arrived in Italy, they did not see combat there and were instead handed an even bigger mission, Operation Dragoon, the invasion of southern France. At 6:30 p.m. on August 15, 1944, as part of the 1st Airborne Task Force, the men of the 551st jumped into combat, marking their first daylight combat drop of the war. As the paratroopers spilled out of their aircraft over Drop Zone A, dozens of parachutes filled the sky over the French Riviera as the men descended near Nice, with some landing miles away in La Motte. Scattered but determined, the Goyas hit the ground running, secured roads, and pushed north while cutting through German positions. By the next day, they had advanced 4 miles and became the first American unit to enter Draguignan, liberating the town ahead of the main invasion force. As the 551st swept through the recently liberated town, gunfire echoed between the buildings, the streets still thick with the remnants of battle. 4 Goyas suddenly spotted a Nazi flag draped over a government building. They moved without hesitation, their boots pounding against the stone steps. The men raced to the roof, where they tore down the Nazi flag, the first captured by American forces in southern France. From there, the Goyas moved east, marching along the Riviera coastline before securing Nice. With the city liberated, for the next 3 months, they were thrown into the French-Italian Alps, holding the right flank of the U.S. 7th Army in a brutal terrain filled with steep ridges and rocky passes, all while the temperature began to drop as winter approached. By late November, the battalion, now attached to the 101st Airborne Division, was pulled out and moved north to France, expecting to regroup for future operations. Then, the Germans struck with a force no one thought was even possible anymore, and the Goyas were back in action. Breaking through to the Ardennes. After 5 long and arduous years of war, the Third Reich was bleeding resources, manpower, and time. Despite this, Adolf Hitler, hidden and deeply isolated in his Wolfslayer headquarters, remained convinced that a single bold strike could still turn the tide in his favor. He gathered his generals, stepping towards the massive battle map before them, and stabbed his finger at the Ardennes, a dense forest stretching across Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. He then laid out his goal: to drive a wedge between Allied forces, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and force the Western Allies into a negotiated peace. The room fell silent as his most senior and trusted officers exchanged uneasy glances. This was a throwback to the Blitzkrieg tactics of 1940, vast, overwhelming assaults designed to paralyze the enemy. But now, Germany was fighting on 2 collapsing fronts, and with its armies battered, victory was a tall order. Still, Hitler knew that a successful counterattack in the Ardennes could buy Germany time to stabilize the Eastern Front and regain the initiative. To maintain secrecy, he gave the offensive a misleading name: Wacht am Rhein, or Watch on the Rhine, a defensive-sounding code. The attack fell to Field Marshal Walter Model's 5th and 6th Panzer armies, tasked with punching through a thinly held American sector, a mix of fresh recruits and exhausted veterans. Eisenhower had shifted forces elsewhere, assuming the Ardennes was too rugged for a major assault. The worst winter in decades had already set in, with blizzards and freezing temperatures making an attack seem even less likely. On December 16th, the Americans were proven wrong when Hitler's forces began their attack on the Ardennes. In addition to being caught off guard, the thick fog and snowfall grounded Allied air support, leaving the defending troops vulnerable. Nonetheless, these inexperienced and exhausted divisions would try desperately to hold the line, creating what would soon be known as the Battle of the Bulge. Desperate to contain the breach, Eisenhower scrambled his reserves. The journey. When the Ardennes offensive began, the 551st was ordered to reinforce the northern flank, moving toward Webbemont, Belgium, under the 82nd Airborne Division. Under normal circumstances, the road to Webbemont should have been a 4-hour drive. Instead, it took 2 whole days as the Goyas fought through blocked roads, artillery fire, Luftwaffe strafing runs, and blinding snowstorms through December 19th and 20th. But their biggest obstacle wasn't the enemy, but the endless stream of American tanks and artillery retreating in the opposite direction, terrified. By the night of December 21st, the 551st finally reached Webbemont. Assigned to the 30th Infantry Division, they were ordered to ditch their heavy overcoats and overshoes to stay light and move fast, assured their gear would catch up to them later. It never would. So began the Goyas' 2-week ordeal, bouncing between units, fighting battle after battle against the enemy in the unforgiving winter. On the 22nd, Eisenhower sent a powerful message to all the troops fighting in the Ardennes that stated, quote, "By rushing from his fixed defense, the enemy may give us the chance to turn his great gamble into his worst defeat. Let everyone hold before him a single thought: to destroy the enemy on the ground, in the air, everywhere. Destroy him." By Christmas Eve, the 551st dug in near Stavelot, holding the right flank of the 30th Infantry Division. The paratroopers, used to their bold antics of jumping out of the sky, were now stuck in the woods, attached to a regular infantry unit, feeling isolated and out of place. Most importantly, the temperature dropped to 0 at night, leaving them no choice but to stay frozen in their foxholes, with nothing else to do but fuel their paranoia. Some swore the Germans had already slipped past them. Others whispered about enemy soldiers disguised in U.S. uniforms, driving stolen jeeps and taking no prisoners. Somewhere in the dark, rumors of Tiger tanks on the move sent shivers through the ranks. Whether this was true didn't matter. The Goyas had to wait. When a last-minute order for an attack across the Somme River was cancelled, Joerg and his men took the reprieve for what it was, a Christmas miracle. Huddled together in the cold, the men ate boiled rubbery turkey, sang carols, and tried to convince themselves they were lucky. Noirfontaine. By December 27th, with the German offensive slowed, the Allies were finally preparing to strike back. Leading the charge was General James Gavin, commander of the 82nd, a paratrooper to his corps, known for jumping into combat alongside his men rather than commanding from a distance. But before the counterattack could begin, he needed intel, and to gather it, he needed a unit fast, aggressive, and willing to take risks, one exactly like the 551st. At last, the Goyas had their next mission. Just past 11 p.m., Joerg's men slipped past the exhausted troops and stepped into enemy territory with a clear purpose: hit fast, hit hard, and get out. For this, Captain Tim Quinn's C Company led the advance, his men pushing through the cold, the shell-torn trees, and the abandoned German positions. Simultaneously, Captain Marshall Dalton's A Company moved along the right flank, keeping pace in the dark, while behind them, Captain Jim Evans' B Company stayed in reserve, ready to reinforce if the attack turned ugly. Just ahead lay the village of Noirfontaine, and though the first gunshot shattered the silence, catching the enemy off guard, the defending Germans reacted fast. As small arms fire cracked through the village, the Panzer IV rolled out of the darkness, steel grinding against the frozen earth. Thankfully, Captain Quinn spotted it just in time, and without hesitation ordered a powerful bazooka charge, yelling, quote, "I want you to go up the road, and don't come back unless you're dragging them damn tanks by the tail." Within minutes, the Panzer IV exploded in flames. Now the road was theirs, but the night was far from over. When their promised artillery support failed to appear, Lieutenant Robert Buscher's mortars took over, unleashing 400 rounds that set buildings ablaze and sent German troops scattering. Some ran for cover, others fought, but no matter what, all ran straight into the Goyas. Through fire and chaos, they cleared Noirfontaine street by street. For nearly an hour, hand-to-hand combat raged as they pushed south, crushing every last German holdout in the nearby villages. While the Germans launched 2 counterattacks through the night, Captain Jim Evans' B Company held the line. Finally, at 5 a.m, the 551st carefully followed the same path they'd come in, knowing one wrong step meant setting off a mine. Despite a couple of casualties, the Noirfontaine raid was a complete success, and General Gavin was impressed. But there was no time to celebrate. Eisenhower ordered a full-scale offensive. On New Year's Day, Joerg met with Gavin, where the 551st was assigned to the 517th Parachute Infantry Regiment for a January 3rd attack on the Irispe Ridge. Irispe Ridge. Once again, Joerg ordered A and C companies to attack the ridge, with B Company in reserve. Company commanders recommended that the battalion's heavy overcoats and overshoes be left behind again to ensure fast movement during the attack. At 6 a.m. on January 3rd, men of the battalion began moving toward Irispe Ridge, a 700-yard-long trek across an open, snow-covered field. To Company A's Doug Dillard, the advance felt like, quote, walking on a sled run, and I fell down several times, and so did others, their weapons banging on their heads. German artillery and mortars tore right into them. Seeing the artillery shells hit the far edge of the woods, but knowing this wasn't enough, Quinn called for more firepower. The forward observer gave him the bad news, that ammo was limited, and the Goyas were on their own. With the Germans holding the high ground with near-perfect visibility from their prey, casualties continued to mount very rapidly, taking out A Company's mortar squad. Just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, 2 Tiger tanks, one straight ahead and the other flanking the attack, appeared out of thin air. Standing out against the white snow, the men of the 551st became sitting ducks as the vehicles opened fire at point-blank range. As the Americans ran and dove for cover as best they could, Quinn's C Company reached the tree line, driving the Germans from their foxholes in brutal close-quarters combat. Despite the victory, Joerg's decision to wait for A Company proved disastrous, as enemy artillery pounded the ridge for 15 brutal minutes. By twilight, they were shattered, barely able to push forward on the frozen ground. When reinforcements finally arrived, survivors were drained, and had even hurt themselves trying to dig foxholes with their bare hands. As the survivors stumbled back that night, the cold became their newest enemy, with temperatures plunging below zero. For many, falling asleep meant never waking up. Now, cut off and alone, the 551st had lost contact with the units on both flanks. Their radios were failing, their heavy coats still hadn't arrived, and the only sign of home, a jeep carrying Christmas packages, had just been obliterated by German rockets. The attack on Iris Bay Ridge had cost the battalion nearly 200 casualties, almost a third of its strength, the hardest hit being A Company, which was now down to 45 men, with C Company faring just a little better. Since B Company had 83 men remaining, Colonel Wood decided to have it lead the attack the next day, hoping it wouldn't be as tough as their fight on the Iris Bay Ridge. Fix bayonets. On January 4th, as the 551st advanced on Darumont, a small but fortified village standing between them and the next phase of the assault, sniper fire pinned down B Company, while C Company's flanking attempt stalled against the entrenched Germans. Running out of alternatives, Woerg sent in A Company, splitting them into two, one led by Captain Quinn himself, while the other group fell under the command of Lieutenant Dick Durkee, a hardened officer. Before either could even reach the village, German machine guns pinned them in place. Though the fog made it impossible to see, the sound of the Germans adjusting their fire, locking onto their positions, were unmistakable. Durkee knew they had mere seconds before they were cut down, and with the enemy focused on Quinn's team, he yelled, quote, "Fix bayonets." With this, all the emotions the men had been feeling, from hunger to cold to the heartbreak of losing comrades by the minute, boiled over, and Durkee's men charged straight into the enemy, bayonets flashing as they crashed through the snow-covered ground. After being the first to reach the enemy line, Lieutenant Durkee and his men waited for the support tanks, expecting 2 full companies of infantry to arrive alongside them. But as the battle raged on, they realized their backup had been reduced to just 20 men. It didn't matter. The Goyas pushed forward, clearing Darumont house by house, until by January 5th, the enemy had been driven back a mile and a half. But the cost was staggering. 90 losses, 150 wounded, 2 captured. Those few lucky soldiers who could still stand refused to report their injuries, fearing a trip to the aid station meant being reassigned and ripped away from what remained of their beloved battalion. By the next morning, the cold had claimed a further 25 men. The Goyas were still standing, but just barely. One last target. As the Americans pressed forward, the Germans retreated across the Zalm River, abandoning position after position. Their last foothold was Rochelinval, a small village perched on a plateau, guarding a vital bridge. Machine guns lined the bluffs, covering the steep gully and open ground leading to the tree line 300 yards away. Woerg's orders were to take Rochelinval and cut off the enemy's escape. But with his battalion battered by days of brutal combat and freezing temperatures, he knew this would be their hardest fight yet. The attack was set for early January 7th. Woerg positioned his command post just 300 yards from Rochelinval's defenses and gathered his remaining officers. A Company, with only 60 men, would lead from the left. Lieutenant Booth split them into 2 squads, one under Durkee and the other under Lieutenant Charles Dahl. On the right, B Company, led by Lieutenants Charlie Buckenmeyer and Joe Keenley, would attempt to flank the enemy. Meanwhile, the 40 men of C Company, under Lieutenant Leroy Sano, remained in reserve near Woerg's command post, ready to reinforce as needed. Woerg took in the brutal reality. His men were exhausted, running on little food, and many were wounded. Some could barely stand, their feet blackened from the freezing cold. The possibility of their promised gear and equipment had all but evaporated. But there was no turning back. Woerg sent a young lieutenant to track down the 3 tanks promised for support, while he scrambled to secure artillery fire to soften up the German defenses. When the request was denied, a furious Woerg got on the line himself, demanding fire. After a heated exchange, 4 shells were finally launched at the enemy bluff. It wasn't enough. The shells had done little more than wake the Germans up. As the battalion moved into position, The sound of German preparations echoed through the cold morning air. Lieutenant Durkee, who had led the brutal charge at Deramont just days before, steadied himself. He'd done this before, and he would do it again. But this time, there was no mistaking it. Everyone in the 551st Parachute Infantry Battalion knew. This was the fight they wouldn't walk away from. Battle of Rochelinval. At 6:30 a.m., the stillness shattered with an unintended shot, a misfire that ignited the assault. Within seconds, the battlefield exploded into chaos as German and American tracer rounds slashed through the cold morning air, with events happening one right after the other. Booth barely took 2 steps before a burst of machine gun fire cut him down. Without hesitation, Durkee shouted for his men to follow him up a narrow, brush-lined lane leading straight into Rochelinval, right where the Germans were waiting with a machine gun. More guns fired from all angles, pinning A Company from all sides. The first man trying to make it through barely made it a few steps before a burst of gunfire cut him down. Another lunged forward, grabbing his fallen comrade's weapon and unleashing a furious barrage into the enemy line. For a brief moment, the Germans hesitated. Then a wall of bullets tore through him, dropping him right where he stood. Durkee lunged forward, his hands closing around a bazooka still gripped by a fallen soldier. Swinging it onto his shoulder, he aimed at the machine gun nest tearing into his men and fired straight at it. With the way briefly clear, Durkee and Dahl crawled ahead, moving low through the snow, when a sudden shot cracked through the air from a sniper. After throwing a grenade at the sniper that fell short, Durkee turned to signal for covering fire when he realized his brother-in-arms, Dahl, was on the ground. Calling for reinforcements over the gunfire, he was heartbroken when Private Pat Casanova's hoarse voice responded, quote, "Sir, they're all gone." As Durkee glanced around, only 2 men were left standing beside him. Crawling back to what little cover remained, he tried to process the reality. 9 men. That was all. Elsewhere, First Sergeant William Harper of C Company pulled the pin on a grenade and hurled it toward the gun that had shredded A Company, one less weapon firing on his men. Nearby, Lieutenant Colonel Joerg pulled himself from his foxhole, boots crunching against the frost as he ran toward the tree line, watching as his men locked in a brutal fight for every inch of Rochelinval. Trying to look around to understand where to push next, a barrage of German artillery ripped through the trees, detonating in the canopy above. Within seconds, splinters and fire rained down, and in the chaos, a single 120mm shell burst overhead, shearing Joerg's helmet open and causing him to collapse into the snow. Soon, word spread like wildfire. It was impossible. Their commander, the heart of the 551st, the man who had led them through hell and back, was gone. Some dropped to their knees in the snow, others clenched their rifles tighter, their breaths coming in short, ragged gasps. For a brief, suspended moment, the Goyas, who had always fought with incredible defiance, felt defeated. But there was no time to grieve. The battle wasn't over. The final stretch. With Joerg gone, command fell to Major Bill Holm, who wasted no time ordering B Company to press forward, closing in on a German strongpoint, and though mortar fire pounded the ground around them, they kept moving. When a sudden rush of enemy troops came charging in, the still-fighting Goyas met them head-on, and a brutal close-quarters fight ensued. While on the other side of the village, C Company stormed a machine gun nest, wiping out its entire crew. By mid-morning, the Americans were still being hammered from multiple directions when, at 11:30 a.m., an unexpected ally arrived, a lone U.S. tank. Despite a jammed turret that couldn't fire, its commander was convinced to push forward anyway, knowing that even an inoperable tank was enough to shake enemy morale. The ruse worked, and late that morning, the surviving Goyas broke into the outskirts of Rochelinval, pushing street by street in house-to-house combat. Despite holding out for as long as possible, by noon, the 183rd Regiment of the 62nd Volksgrenadier Division collapsed, their soldiers throwing down their weapons en masse. By the end of the day, the 551st had taken well over 400 prisoners. Although victorious in capturing Rochelinval and eliminating the last German bridgehead for over 10 miles in the Somme River, for the 551st Parachute Infantry Battalion, this was hardly a victory. When all was said and done, the Goyas had suffered more than 94% casualties, the highest rate of any battalion to fight at the Battle of the Bulge, destroyed by a combination of sleep deprivation, starvation, and a relentless enemy. When the Goyas were relieved on January 9, 1945, out of the 643 men who entered the battle, only 14 officers and 96 men remained. Following the Battle of the Bulge, the 551st was officially disbanded. According to United States Army Sergeant Don Garrigues, quote, "A piece of paper did something the Germans couldn't do: eliminate our gallant battalion." After the dissolution, the majority of the 110 men remaining in the battalion were split up and reassigned to parachute units in the 82nd Airborne Division, carrying the airborne spirit of the Goyas wherever they went. When Hitler first envisioned his wintertime counteroffensive through the Ardennes in December 1944, he wholeheartedly believed that his armies could duplicate the success they had enjoyed in 1940. He was wrong.